Yo, what's going on guys, Jin here. This is the 19,000th Ball Lightning build guide on YouTube, and this one's built around getting the most out of Tal Rasha's Iridescent loot, and getting great crit damage. Like most Ball Lightning builds, it does tier 100s no problem, Ubers no problem, and everything else in the game no problem. If you do find this video informative, consider liking and subscribing as it helps the channel a lot. Now let's get to the build. So let's start with the skills. We're going to start with 2 in Firebolt here in our basic skills, as we're going to use that for our enchantment effect. Then we're going to come down to our core skills, grab 1 into Potent Warding, 1 into Devastation, and 3 in Elemental Dominance. Then we're going to grab 1 in Chain Lightning, then go down to Destructive Chain Lightning, and this is going to be our other enchantment. So then we move down here to our defensive skills. We're going to take 1 in Flame Shield with Mystical Flame Shield, 1 into Teleport. I have 13 points from items. And then we're going to take Shimmering Teleport. Then 3 in Glass Cannon. I have 3 from items here as well. 1 into Elemental Attunement. 1 into Ice Armor. And then we're going to go for Mystical Ice Armor. And 1 Frost Nova with Mystical Frost Nova. Then we come down to our Conjuration skills, and this is where we pick up our Ice Blades. And then we're going to go for the Summoned Ice Blades. So 20% of Enhanced Ice Blades cooldown reduction is applied to our other skills. Really helpful there with our CDR, and that's also going to apply our cold damage for our Tal Rasha's Ring. Then we're going to get 1 point into Align the Elements, so we can get the 3 in Mana Shield, which is very important for all that extra damage reduction. And for 3 in Protection, so this is also very important, as a lot of our damage comes whilst we have a barrier up. So this is going to allow us to use cooldowns to get a barrier for 30% of our maximum life. Then we come down here to Mastery skills, and we're going to get 1 into Inner Flames here, which is not that important. We just need to get the 3 in Devouring Blaze. So we deal 21% increased critical strike damage against burning enemies, and that will be all of them, thanks to our Firebolt enchant. And if they're immobilized, this bonus is increased to 30%. And then of course we're going to take 5 in Ball Lightning, and then we're going to go for Wizard's Ball Lightning. Then we're going to take 1 in Static Discharge, so we can get the 3 in Invigorating Conduit. So when we absorb Crackling Energy, we gain 12 mana. So this is a huge source of mana for us here. Then we're going to come down to our ultimate skills, just to take the Coursing Currents passive, so we can get the 3 in Electrocution. And I've thrown our 2 remaining points, besides the one we use for our key passive, into Conduction. If you're really having mana issues though, you can put these 2 points into Fiery Surge, so you always have an extra 30% mana regeneration, which come in quite handy. So for the key passive, we're going to take Esu's Ferocity. So we're using this key passive to proc our Ancient's Flame aspect. All critical strikes that kill enemies or hit a boss do grant both bonuses, which does proc Ancient's Flame, and that will give us an extra 40 to 50% attack speed. So if you aren't using the Ancient's Flame aspect, you would use the Veer's Mastery key passive. So you'll take 20% less damage from close enemies, which is increased by your critical strikes. The damage portion of this key passive may still be bugged though, so you might not get any bonuses from that part. But still, it makes you quite a bit tankier if you find yourself getting killed in the higher tier Nightmare dungeons, then this could be an option for you. So that is it for the skills. Let's move on to the Paragon board. So here we are with the Paragon boards. It's very similar to the last build, maybe a couple of changes here and there. So let's just get into it. So we have the Charge Glyph in our first board here, the starting board. And we're going to get Crackling Energy damage from that, as well as picking up a Crackling Energy grants us 5% increased damage for 5 seconds, up to 15%. Then we move on to our second board, the Enchantment Master board, and we're going to put the Tactician Glyph in here, and that's going to give us an increase in damage, 10% for 4 seconds after casting a defensive skill, as well as getting a nice bonus to rare nodes within range, so in this case the Erudite rare node, and also the Elemental Balance rare node. Then we move on to our third board here, and that is the Ceaseless Conduit board. And we're going to put the exploit glyph in here for a bunch of extra vulnerable damage, and also dealing damage to a vulnerable enemy increases damage by 1%, up to 10%. And we're going to make sure we get the Hunter Killer Ray node here for the extra movement speed after killing an elite, as well as a bunch of extra damage to elites, 32%. So then we come up to our fourth board, Frigid Fate, and we're going to put the Adept glyph in here. That gives us a whole lot of mastery skill damage, and I don't believe Ball Lightning benefits from the mastery skills have 20% increased area, but nonetheless we just want the mastery skill damage. And we're going to pick up the Oppressive Ray node while we're at it for a whole bunch of extra vulnerable damage. Then we're going to go into our fifth board here, and this is the Burning Instinct board. And we're going to put in the Destruction glyph for all our extra critical strike damage, as well as critical strikes increase all damage the enemy takes from us by 2% for 10 seconds up to 12%. And we're going to come to the middle here and take the Kindling Ray node for an extra 10% damage to burning enemies, as well as 16% damage to elites. Then we'll come down here to our sixth board, and that is the Searing Heat board, and we're going to go ahead and put the Control glyph in here. So that gives us damage to crowd-controlled enemies, and also we deal 10% increased damage to slowed or chilled enemies, or 20% increased damage to stunned or frozen enemies. So really nice there. And last but not least, board number 7, the Static Surge board, and that's going to give us an excellent source of vulnerable. As you can see, after spending mana, our next cast of Chain Lightning makes enemies vulnerable for 2 seconds, and restores 10% of our mana. So really good glyph here, great source of vulnerable and also a great source of mana. And we're going to pick up the Overwhelming Ray node here, just for a bunch of extra damage to elites. And as for the glyph, we're going to put in the Territorial glyph. So that's an extra 15% damage reduction against close enemies, and also a bunch of damage to close enemies. So that's pretty much it for the Paragon board, nice and simple. All of this is going to be listed in the build planner in the description below. So just give that a look, and everything else will be in there as well, of course. The skill tree, the gear, the enchantments, the vampiric powers, etc. So give that a look if you need more detail. So now for the enchantments, as I mentioned in the skill tree, we're going to be taking the Chain Lightning enchantment. So a Chain Lightning will form automatically after spending 100 mana. And with our 2 modifiers, we get 3% increased critical strike chance per bounce, which is fine. But also, more importantly, when Chain Lightning critically strikes, it has a 30% chance to form a Crackling Energy. So the Crackling Energy, of course, gives us increased damage when we pick it up, and also mana. Then for our second enchantment, we're going to be taking the Firebolt enchantment, so dealing direct damage with skills, applies an additional amount of burning damage over 8 seconds. So now let's talk about the Vampiric powers. Now for our Vampiric powers, we're going to want to take 9 packs of Ferocity, 2 packs of Divinity, and 2 packs of Eternity. And for our first power here, we're going to be taking Prey on the Weak, just for an extra 16% increased damage to vulnerable enemies. Then we're going to take Metamorphosis for our second power, so when we evade, we turn into a card of Bat, and become unstoppable for 4 seconds. For our third power, we're going to take Ravenous. So on lucky hit, we have 20% chance to increase our attack speed by 40% of our total movement speed, which is 49% in my case, which is quite a lot of attack speed. Then for our fourth power, we have Domination. So that's just dealing an extra 24% increased damage to enemies who are stunned, immobilized, frozen, or feared. If they're also injured and not an elite, they're instantly killed, which is great, more dead demons for us. And then for our last power, we're going to take Infection. So hitting enemies with direct damage infects them with pox, and inflicting pox 8 times on an enemy expunges their infection, dealing poison damage. So last but not least, we have the gear, and on the left I'll be listing the best affixes that I think you should have on each piece. So let's start with the Helm. For the Helm, we're going to want to look for total armor percent, cooldown reduction, maximum life, and all stats. Now if you can't get that, you want to look for intelligence, crowd control duration, or life on kill. And as for the aspect, we're going to be taking the ever living aspect. So we will take 20 to 25% less damage from crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies. Now this helm is for running the T100 dungeons, as obviously the ever-living and the total armor percent are a huge amount of damage reduction. But if you're in the overworld or doing something simple like Ubers, then you would just wear a Godslayer crown. As you can see, this gives a huge amount of damage, as well as giving a awesome unique aspect. So when we stun, freeze, or immobilize an elite enemy, or when we damage a boss, it pulls in nearby enemies and you deal 30 to 60% increased damage to them for 3 seconds, which is generally enough time to kill or severely injure any Uber boss. So next up we have the chest piece. We're going to look for total armor percent, damage reduction from close, damage reduction from distant, and max life. If you can't get those, look for damage reduction, all stats, or intelligence. As for the aspect, we're going to put disobedience on here, so we gain 1.1% increased armor for 4 seconds when you deal any form of damage, stacking up to 66%. This build deals an insane amount of instances of damage, so it stacks up really fast. It's a massive boost to armor, so it's a must-have aspect. Next up, the gloves. We're going to look for something with critical hit chance, attack speed, critical hit chance against injured, and all stats. If you can't get that, look for intelligence, lucky hit chance, or chain lightning. Now as for the aspect, we're going to put on the storm swell aspect here, so we deal 21 to 30% increased damage to vulnerable enemies while we have a barrier. So of course we're almost always going to have a barrier on, and most enemies are going to be vulnerable, so this is a massive increase in damage. Next up we have the pants, and the best in slot 100% is Tibault's Will, so we get a huge amount of increase in damage here, just from wearing the pants. As you can see, 26.2% damage here for a perfect roll. We get 4 potion capacity, we get some maximum resource, as well as damage reduction from close enemies, which is really nice. Now most importantly, we get this awesome unique aspect here. So we deal 40% in my case, increased damage while unstoppable, and for 4 seconds after. And also when we become unstoppable, we gain 50 of our primary resource. So as you may have noticed with the Vampiric powers, Metamorphosis makes us unstoppable whenever we evade, so we are almost always going to be dealing 40% increased damage and gaining a lot of primary resource back just every time we evade and proc our unstoppable or cast teleport and become unstoppable. So definitely the best in slot here. Try and get this as soon as you can. If you don't happen to have Tibault's Will, then you would use something with total armor percent, damage reduction from close, damage reduction from distant, and ranks into ball lightning. Now if you can't get those affixes, then look for damage reduction, max life, all stats, or intelligence. And as for the aspect, just something like Crowded Sage works just fine, or something like Protector. Next up we have the boot. We're using Esu's Heirloom. Of course we're using this for the unique aspect here, but we also get movement speed after killing an elite, critical strike damage, which is the other reason we're using it, and mana cost reduction, which is always nice. So the unique aspect, our critical strike chance is increased by 20 to 30% of our movement speed bonus. Now if you don't have Esu's Heirloom, you would want to use Penitent Greaves. So we leave behind a trail of frost that chills enemies and deal 10% more damage to chilled enemies. If you can't get either of those two boots, then you would just want to look for boots with movement speed, mana cost reduction, all stats, and ranks into teleport. If you can't get those affixes, then something with intelligence, or dodge percent / damage reduction when injured. And as for the aspect, you would want to use the Ghost Walker aspect. So whilst unstoppable and for 4 seconds after, you gain 10 to 25% increased movement speed, and can also move freely through enemies, which is really handy. Next up we have the main hand. So for my one-handed weapon here, I'll be using the Oculus. Obviously we're going to look for a high item power, as high as we can, 925 being the highest base item power, just so we can get the most damage per second possible. So the Oculus here obviously gives us a huge amount of damage percent, as well as some maximum evade charges, attacks reduce evade's cooldown by 0.9 seconds in my case, and an insane amount of ranks to teleport. We also gain the effect of the teleport enchantment for free, and when we evade using teleport enchantment, we're taken to a random location. but that is cancelled out by Metamorphosis as well, so the location will be where we choose to evade to. Now, if you don't have the Oculus, or prefer to use a normal weapon, you would look for a max item powered dagger for the extra damage to close enemies. And for the stats, the affixes rather, you would want to use all stats, vulnerable damage, mastery skill damage, and damage to close enemies. Now if you can't get that, you would look for critical strike damage or intelligence. Now for the aspect, you would use the Ancient Flame aspect, so while both bonuses from Asu's Ferocity's key passive are active, your attack speed is increased by 40 to 50%, so obviously this is a huge amount of damage. So both options, the Oculus or the Awesome Dagger, work really well. If you can't find a dagger and you happen to have the stats on a wand, don't worry too much about it, it's only 30% damage to close, so just use the wand, especially if it has all of the right affixes like this one here. Next up we have the necklace, so we're going to want to look for ranks to glass cannon, ranks to mastery skills, total armor, and intelligence percent or damage percent. I don't think mana cost reduction is necessary for this build because I am basically never really out of mana. And I don't think cooldown reduction is that necessary either, as I've not really had a problem with my cooldowns with this build. But if you can't get intelligence or damage, then look for one of those two stats, or something like damage reduction from close, flat damage reduction, or damage reduction from distant. And as for the aspect, we're going to be using the gravitational aspect, so that will make our ball lightning orbit around us and deal an extra 23 to 38% increased damage. So we put this aspect on the necklace to get the 1.5 times bonus we get. So if we put it on the gloves or something like that, it would only go up to 25%. So next up we have the rings. For our first ring, we're going to be using our Tal Rasha's Iridescent loop, of course, which is what a lot of the stuff in this build is based around. So it gives us non-physical damage, lucky hit chance, resource generation, and cooldown reduction. But more importantly, gives us an awesome unique aspect to work with. So for each type of elemental damage we deal, gain 11% in my case, increased damage for 4 seconds, and dealing elemental damage refreshes all bonuses. So what this means is, once you have the stacks, so let's say for example I have 4 stacks on, dealing any elemental damage will keep refreshing the 4 stacks. So once it's stacked up, it's basically just a permanent buff whenever you're in combat, dealing elemental damage. So it's very easy to get to 3 stacks with this build, as Chain Lightning / Ball Lightning will give you 1 stack, the Firebolt enchantment will give you a 2nd stack, Ice Blades will give you a 3rd stack, and the 4th stack comes from inflicting the Infection Vampiric power, which will deal poison damage. This is a bit harder to proc in the overworld as things die really fast, so you never get to hit anything 8 times, but in tier 100 dungeons and on bosses this will stack very easily. So if you get a max rolled aspect, that will be an extra 60% increased damage. For our other ring, we're going to be looking for something with critical strike chance, vulnerable damage, damage to close enemies, and resource generation. If you can't get that, you would want to look for something with critical strike damage or maximum life. Now as for the aspect, if you are using the Oculus, this is where you would put Ancient Flame, but if you're using a one-handed dagger or wand with Ancient Flame, you would put on something like Control, so that will deal you an extra 25 to 35% more damage to immobilize, stunned, or frozen enemies. Now, if you are having mana issues still with this build, then you could easily put something like Recharging on there, so each time Chain Lightning bounces, you gain 1.5 to 3 mana, and that should basically solve any remaining mana issues you have. If you don't have a Tal Rasha's Iridescent loop, just run a bunch of Varshans. It's not that rare of a ring. You should be able to find it pretty easily unless you're very unlucky. But until you find one, you would just basically use a duplicate of your other ring with the same 4 affixes. And for the aspect, you would put on Recharging and Control on your 2 rings, like I said, unless you're using Ancient Flame and the Oculus. So last but not least, we have the offhand weapon. So obviously we're going to want max item power for the damage per second. And for the affixes, we're going to look for critical strike chance, mana cost reduction, resource generation, and then cooldown reduction. And if you can't get that, look for all stats or intelligence. And as for the aspect, we're going to be putting on Conceited, so we deal an extra 15 to 25% increased damage while we have a barrier active. So that does it for the gear. Now quickly, as you can see, the gems. We have the green gems in the offhand and main hand, the red gems in the armor, and the skulls in the jewelry. So that pretty much wraps up the build. Thank you for watching the video, and if you learned something from this build or just enjoyed the video in general, please hit the subscribe button and the thumbs up as well, and notifications if you want to see notifications, of course. Thanks a lot again, and I guess I will just leave you with some footage of this build clearing some T100 Nightmare dungeons. Thanks for watching. Bye!